she wasn't supposed to stop here. For 3 consecutive mornings, all 12 goats left the grazing area, climbed the same hillside, and stopped in front of exactly the same dense wall of kudzu. They weren't panicked. They didn't cry out. They didn't try to turn back. They simply stood shoulder to shoulder, staring at the dark green tangle of vines, as if something behind it existed that their instincts understood far better than any human. Margaret Hale watched them for 3 days, searching for a simple explanation, maybe a snake, maybe a sinkhole, maybe just the smell of a dead animal. But by the 3rd morning, when all 12 goats stopped again in the exact same spot, she knew she was no longer looking at a coincidence. She was looking at a pattern. Margaret walked back to the old pickup, took the machete still sticky with vine sap from the day before, and slowly climbed the slope. The first stroke sliced through the young kudzu vines. The second opened a small patch of light. On the 3rd stroke, the blade suddenly struck hard against something solid hidden beneath the thick layer of vines. The sound was not like stone, nor was it like a rotting branch. Margaret froze. For several seconds, she simply stared in silence at the place where the blade had stopped. Then the story carried her back 3 months earlier, to the day everyone in the county believed she had just made the most foolish decision of her life. 3 months earlier, Margaret Hale, 43 years old, had just become a widow after her husband, Ethan Hale, died of a heart attack right in the middle of harvest season. Within only a few weeks, the unpaid bills, the bank loan, and the medical expenses had forced her to sell nearly the entire cattle herd, most of the machinery, and everything the two of them had spent years building. The only thing Margaret did not sell was her determination to start over. When Unicoi County announced it would auction a 50-acre tract completely swallowed by kudzu after years of neglect, most people saw it merely as an administrative formality to clear a burden from the books. The starting bid was only $1. Not because the land was worthless, but because no one wanted to take it on. In the small county auction room, Margaret was the only person who raised a bid paddle. The whole room burst into laughter. Luke Dawson, owner of a large nearby farm, leaned back in his chair and laughed loud enough for everyone to hear. Even the county wanted to forget that place. No one argued with him. For nearly 10 years, the land had been notorious as a place that could not be reclaimed. 2 previous owners had brought in large bulldozers, modern excavators, and entire crews paid by the hour. They cleared roads, cut trees, pulled vines, and spent tens of thousands of dollars. The only results they left behind were broken machines, a few torn-up dirt tracks, and the firm conviction that the place was not worth saving. Margaret knew all those stories before she signed the purchase papers. What she did not have was money to do what they had done. She could not hire an excavator. She could not hire labor. She could not borrow another dollar. The only thing she managed to borrow were 12 goats from a stockman in the next town, an old trailer, and a few sections of portable fencing. Harold Whitmore, the man who lent her the trailer, agreed only for 14 days, because he still needed it for the next grazing season. After that deadline, Margaret would have to return both the trailer and the goats. If things did not progress fast enough, her plan would end before it truly began. Even so, when she held the deed to the land in her hands, Margaret still felt she had just reclaimed the first thing that belonged completely to her since the day Ethan died. It was not a fertile farm. It was not a desirable property. In the eyes of the whole county, it was only 50 acres of worthless vines. But to Margaret, it was the last chance to begin again. At that moment, she had no idea that weeks later, those same 12 goats would refuse to step into one small corner of the land. And somewhere behind that seemingly endless wall of kudzu, something was making the entire herd make the exact same decision, as if nature itself were trying to tell her, "Do not go any farther, at least not yet." Margaret began working before the sun rose and usually returned to the old pickup only after the hills around Unicoi County had sunk into darkness. Each day's work was so identical that it seemed it would never end. She set up each section of portable fencing to limit the grazing area, hauled plastic water troughs across the uneven ground, and led the 12 goats into one small paddock after another. When they had stripped the young kudzu leaves clean, she took the fencing down, moved to the next section, and started over. Between moving the goats, Margaret had to drive down the hill for water, fill the tanks, and climb back up again. Some days she walked miles just to carry a few tools to repair fencing knocked down by deer or strong winds. Then, while the goats rested in the shade of the trees, she took the machete and cut the vines too thick for them to handle. The work never looked like a miracle. It was only thousands of small actions repeated with a patience. Few people still had time to give a piece of land the whole county had written off as hopeless. Luke Dawson never missed a chance to mock her. Whenever he drove past in his brand new pickup, he slowed down, lowered the window, and looked toward Margaret with a smile that was half pity, half ridicule. One afternoon, Luke even used his phone to film the 12 goats with their heads down eating kudzu and laughed loudly with the group of friends standing beside him. "That's the cheapest landscaping crew in Tennessee," he said, sending the whole group into laughter. The video spread quickly through town. People stopped by the roadside just to see with their own eyes the widow using a few goats to do the work 2 bulldozers had failed at. Some shook their heads. Some laughed outright. Others placed bets on how many days she would last before quitting. No one truly believed the land could change. Margaret heard nearly every remark. But instead of answering, she simply continued her work. She knew every hour spent arguing was an hour the goats were not eating more vines. Ethan had once said that land does not care about people's opinions. It only responds to what people actually do on it. Margaret remembered that sentence every time she felt exhausted. Some afternoons, her shoulders ached so badly she had to sit leaning against a truck tire for a few minutes before she had the strength to stand and drag the fencing to a new position. Some nights of heavy rain she barely slept for fear the wind would knock down the entire temporary fence system. The next morning, she quietly set everything back up from scratch. The first week passed with almost no one seeing any difference. The second week was the same. The kudzu still covered the hillsides like a giant green blanket. But by the third week, the land itself began to tell a different story. Where the goats had been, the first patches of brown earth appeared under the sun after years of being sealed away. One morning, Margaret bent to pick up a stone and realized it was not lying alone. It belonged to an entire row of stones carefully set decades earlier. The next day, the rotting wooden posts began to appear, leaning but still standing in line as if marking an old boundary. A few days later, the stone foundation of a small horse barn emerged from under the vines the goats had stripped bare. Then a narrow drainage ditch revealed itself, still with enough slope for rainwater to run down into the valley after every storm. Those traces caused no sensation. No one wrote about them in the paper. But Margaret understood she was seeing something the excavators had never managed. Instead of tearing the ground apart to find answers, the goats were gently peeling away layer after layer of cover, allowing the past to reveal itself. At that moment, Harold Whitmore returned. He drove his old pickup up the hillside, intending to reclaim the trailer according to the original agreement. When he stepped down, he said nothing. He simply walked slowly along the cleared ground. His eyes rested in turn on the newly exposed stone rows, the old wooden posts, the drainage ditch, then looked toward the goats still patiently browsing the new kudzu. Margaret stood waiting, bracing herself to return the trailer and end the plan, when she had only covered a very small part. Harold remained silent. He took the trailer key from his shirt pocket, turned it between his fingers for a few more seconds, then stepped in front of her. "Keep it another month," he said briefly, and placed the key in Margaret's palm. "I've watched people spend thousands of dollars out here and leave with nothing. You're the first person who's actually helping the land breathe again." With that, he turned back to his truck without waiting for thanks. Margaret closed her fingers tightly around the key ring. Another month did not mean she was certain to succeed, but it meant she had another chance to continue. For the first time since Ethan died, someone saw what she saw instead of what everyone else laughed at. That small measure of trust was enough to help her keep going. In the days that followed, progress came faster. The land gradually showed its true shape. Yet among all the areas being freed there remained one small corner near the top of the hill that had not changed at all. The kudzu there was still as thick as ever. There were no tooth marks from the goats. No bare patches of ground appeared. Margaret tried moving the fencing to lead them closer, but every time they were released into that area, all 12 goats circled to the sides and stopped a few steps short of the vine wall. They ate everything around it, leaving only that exact patch of ground as if it did not exist at all. The next morning, Margaret woke before dawn and took the goats up the hillside as usual. She stood at a distance and watched. Without anyone leading them, all 12 goats again walked in a line, climbed the familiar slope, and stopped in unison at the exact same place as the day before. Not one took another step. Margaret tried to convince herself that there had to be a simple explanation. Goats are cautious animals. They can detect danger earlier than people, but they also easily avoid places that make them feel unsafe. On the first morning, when the whole herd stopped in front of the kudzu wall, she thought perhaps a venomous snake had nested somewhere under the dense vines. That was entirely reasonable. Water snakes and copperheads often hide in damp, little-visited areas. If the goats smelled them, refusing to go farther would not be unusual. Margaret took a long stick, pounded it hard on the ground, and waited several minutes. No sound answered. She walked along the edge of the vine wall, examining every gap, every crevice in the rocks, and every rotting stump. There was no sign that the place was a reptile den. By the end of the morning, she concluded she had overthought it. The next day, everything would surely return to normal. But the next morning, the moment she opened the gate, all 12 goats again took the exact same path. They needed no one to lead them. They showed no hesitation. One by one, they climbed the hillside, reached the precise spot of the day before, and stopped together. Margaret stood behind and watched. Not one tried to take another step. Not one tried to push through the vines. They simply stood still, heads slightly lowered, eyes fixed on the kudzu wall, as if behind it lay an invisible boundary they all understood. This time, Margaret no longer thought of snakes. She began checking other possibilities. Perhaps under the vines lay an old sinkhole the human eye could not detect. She took a long pole and repeatedly thrust it into the ground ahead. The earth remained solid. There was no hollow space beneath. She continued circling, searching for signs of a dead animal because the smell of a carcass usually keeps livestock away. There was no foul odor, no animal hair, no tracks of black bear or coyote. She bent to examine the soft soil after the previous night's rain. Aside from the hoof prints of the goats themselves, there was nothing else. The more she checked, the more puzzled Margaret became. All the reasonable explanations disappeared one by one. On the third morning, she decided to do nothing at all. Margaret simply stood a few dozen yards from the goats, arms folded, watching like an outsider. Everything unfolded exactly as it had the 2 previous days. The 12 goats left the grazing area, walked in a long line, and stopped at that exact spot. Not earlier, not later. The distance between them barely changed. The lead goat stood closest to the kudzu. The others formed an arc behind it, close enough to touch shoulders, yet still keeping their familiar spacing. Margaret looked at her watch. They stood motionless for nearly 10 minutes. Then one by one they turned to graze on either side, but not a single one stepped into the area in front of them. What sent a chill down her spine was not that they stopped. What she could not ignore was the almost absolute precision of the behavior. If only one animal had done it, it could have been individual instinct. But all 12 made the same decision, at the same place, for 3 consecutive mornings. It was no longer a random reaction. It was a pattern she did not yet understand. Margaret stepped closer. She took hold of the rope around the lead goat's neck and gently pulled forward. The animal braced, planting all 4 feet. It did not panic, did not struggle. It simply refused to advance. Margaret looked into its calm eyes and then, without thinking, released the rope. Ethan had once said that livestock sometimes sense things people miss. Not because they are smarter, but because they do not try to explain everything through guesswork. They only react to what instinct perceives. Margaret suddenly understood. She stood before 2 choices. Either force the goats onward the way people always do with livestock, or accept that perhaps they were seeing something she had not yet seen. After a few seconds of silence, she turned back to the pickup. She opened the truck bed, took the machete that had been with her for 3 weeks. The wooden handle was worn smooth by sweat. The blade was covered with scratches from hundreds of strokes into vines and dry branches. Margaret walked slowly up the hillside. She did not go exactly where the goats stood. She circled to the left, found a small opening, and began cutting into the densest kudzu on the entire property. Vines as thick as a wrist were twisted tightly together into hard cables. The first stroke only cut a few outer layers. The second opened a narrow shaft of light. On the third, the blade suddenly rebounded, sending a numbness through Margaret's arm. The sound was dry and solid, not like stone, not like metal either. She bent down and with both hands pulled the cut vines aside. Layer after layer of kudzu fell away to reveal a patch of grey-brown bark. Margaret froze. It was not a rotting stump. The bark was still intact. When she scraped a small area with her fingertip, pale green tissue appeared underneath. The tree was still alive. After decades buried under vines, that trunk had continued to exist in the darkness. Margaret looked up. The canopy was almost completely sealed. Only a few small branches had managed to reach the light above. She had never imagined a tree could live so long under such dense kudzu. Curiosity drove Margaret to clear several more yards. Another trunk appeared, then another. Each time the vines fell, another tree revealed itself, quietly surviving beneath that giant green blanket. At first, she thought she had simply stumbled on a forgotten clump of old trees. But when she stepped back a few paces to survey the whole newly opened patch, Margaret suddenly felt something was wrong. The distance between the trunks was almost equal. They were not crowded, nor did they grow in the disorderly fashion of a natural forest. One tree stood from the next at nearly identical intervals, forming a faint straight line through the kudzu. Margaret turned slowly in a circle, looking from different angles. The longer she looked, the clearer the feeling became. The trunks had not appeared at random. They seemed to follow an order that people had arranged long before the kudzu swallowed the entire hillside. She drew a deep breath and looked toward the still intact wall of vines ahead. If what she had just discovered was true, then this place was not an abandoned forest. It had never been a natural forest at all. Margaret stood quietly in the newly opened space, letting her eyes adjust to the first rays of sunlight filtering through the fallen kudzu. The longer she looked, the clearer the picture before her became. The trunks did not grow in the tangled way of an old Appalachian forest. They stood in straight rows, each tree spaced from the next at nearly the same distance. She walked slowly along the first row, then turned into the second. The spacing remained unchanged. When she scraped away the leaf litter with the toe of her boot, a narrow stone-lined ditch appeared underfoot. She followed it several dozen steps and found rotting wooden posts still driven in a straight line. Farther on was the stone foundation of an old shed and sections of broken clay water pipe. Not a single detail resembled a natural forest. Everything carried the mark of human hands. Margaret continued clearing more ground. More sunlight poured down, and then the thing she had most hoped for appeared. On the old branches, small apples of strange shapes were beginning to show. They were not uniformly round, not glossy like supermarket fruit. Some were deep red, almost purple. Some pale yellow with remaining streaks of green. She gently picked one and raised it to her nose. The fragrance was rich and deep, reminding her of the orchards of her childhood with her parents. When she bit into it, the sweetness came slowly, spreading with a bright tartness very different from modern commercial varieties. Margaret looked up across the hillside. Row after row stretched on until they disappeared behind the uncleared kudzu. She suddenly realized she had not merely found a few surviving old trees. She was standing in the middle of an ancient apple orchard that had slept for generations. A few more signs confirmed it. On one large trunk, an old hand-forged nail, now rusted, was still driven deep into the bark. Near the shed foundation, she picked up a fragment of unusually thick green glass, the kind of bottle seen only in local museums. Under the leaf litter, a small iron sign, almost completely corroded, still faintly showed a number. Everything said the orchard had existed far longer than anyone in the county still remembered. Excitement flooded through Margaret. For weeks, she had only hoped to save a neglected piece of land. Now she believed she had discovered a piece of history the whole region had forgotten. She called a few neighbors who had quietly encouraged her. That weekend, 5 people arrived with pruning shears, handsaws, and machetes to help. No one was laughing anymore. Everyone worked from morning until afternoon. Layer after layer of kudzu fell. Each newly opened patch revealed another row of trees, another section of drainage ditch, more wooden posts marking old paths. This time, the laughter was not mockery, but the joy of discovery. By the end of the weekend, nearly the entire central area of the orchard had been freed. Sunlight poured onto the rows of trees for the first time in decades. Wind moved through the canopies, carrying the light scent of ripening apples. Margaret stood in the middle of the orchard, closed her eyes, and drew a deep breath. She imagined Ethan would have smiled if he could see this. For the first time since her husband died, she felt she was not merely surviving, but truly building something new. She believed that once the remaining kudzu was cleared, the entire orchard would come back to life. But that joy lasted only a few days. Margaret began to notice the leaves on some trees along the southern edge curling abnormally. At first, she thought it was only a reaction after years without light. The next day, the tips of the young branches turned brown, the leaf edges scorched as if they had just endured a drought. When she dug around the roots, she was startled to find the soil that had always been cool and moist now dried out very quickly. Some young apples dropped before they could grow. She immediately watered more and mulched around the bases with dry grass, but the situation did not improve. Each morning, a few more small branches withered. Margaret stood still in the middle of the orchard. The sunlight she had regarded only days earlier as a sign of hope now fell too harshly. She suddenly remembered that for decades these apple trees had lived under the dense kudzu. What she had considered an enemy might have become a protective coat shielding them from heat and water loss. If so, had clearing it too quickly been the very cause of the orchard's weakening? The joy of discovery quickly turned to fear. Margaret no longer knew whether she had just saved the orchard or accidentally pushed it into a new danger. The two previous owners had failed because they tried to conquer the land by force. Was she repeating that mistake in a different way? That afternoon, Margaret returned to the pickup, opened her notebook, and stared a long time at the pages already filled with writing. She understood that determination alone was not enough. This orchard needed someone who truly understood old apple trees. She took out her phone and found the number of Dr. Samuel Pierce, a specialist in heritage apple varieties. When the other end of the line answered, Margaret looked toward the orchard, sinking into the evening light, and said softly, "I think I just found an orchard the whole world forgot. But I'm afraid I'm letting it die." Margaret barely slept the night after that call. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the leaves withering on the old apple trees. They had survived decades under the kudzu, yet only days after being freed, they were already weakening before her eyes. At 9 o'clock the next morning, a dark blue pickup stopped at the entrance to the property. The man who stepped out was Dr. Samuel Pierce, his hair almost completely silver, a well-worn wide-brimmed hat, and a small leather bag full of tools. He shook Margaret's hand briefly and then looked across the hillside without asking a single question. Samuel did not go straight to the withering trees. He began at the edge of the orchard, where the kudzu still covered almost everything. He bent to measure the density of the vines, wrote a few numbers in a small notebook, then used a garden trowel to dig lightly under a tree. He crumbled a handful of soil in his palm, smelled it, and used a small meter to check the moisture. Then he moved into the area Margaret had just cleared and repeated the entire process. For nearly an hour, Samuel said almost nothing. He simply walked very slowly from tree to tree, occasionally running his hand over the old bark, studying the color of the new shoots, then cutting an apple from two different trees. He used an old folding knife to slice each fruit in half. The flesh appeared in distinctly different colors. Some were ivory white. Others showed a pale pink blush spreading outward from the core. Samuel looked a long time before folding the knife shut. Finally, he removed his glasses, turned to Margaret, and said in a calm voice, "The orchard survived because it was never exposed all at once." Margaret stood frozen. Samuel looked up at the kudzu still covering half the hillside and continued explaining. For years, everyone had thought the kudzu was the reason the orchard disappeared. But in that adversity, the vine layer had actually created a stable environment for the old apple trees. It held moisture in the soil after every rain. It reduced the intensity of direct sunlight on trunks that had grown accustomed to shade for decades. It lessened the temperature swings between day and night, protecting the roots from shock. Samuel pointed to the ground where Margaret had cleared the vines completely. When you cleared everything in just a few days, you changed the environment faster than these trees could adapt. They aren't dying from the light. They're dying from the sudden change. Margaret looked down at the wilting leaves. What she had regarded as a victory had turned out to be only the beginning of a much harder lesson. Samuel smiled very slightly. Finding an old orchard is exciting. Keeping it alive is the real work. He opened the map of the property Margaret had drawn over many weeks and took a pen to divide the entire orchard into small sections. He explained that restoration had to happen one section at a time. Each year, only a portion should be freed, enough for the old trees to gradually adapt to light, wind, and changing moisture. Some areas even needed to keep the kudzu for a few more seasons before being treated step by step. "Think in years," he said. "Not weeks." Margaret nodded. She realized she had been too eager from the joy of discovery and had forgotten that nature always has its own rhythm. Samuel continued walking between the rows. He cut a few more apples and called Margaret over. He pointed to each fruit and spoke the names as if greeting old friends. Limbitwig. He moved to the next tree, Old Winesap, a few steps farther. Arkansas Black. Then to a tree with smaller, rough-skinned fruit. Roxbury Russet. Each name was tied to a period in American agricultural history when families grew different apple varieties for baking, for cider, for keeping through winter, or for local markets. Samuel stopped before another tree, cut an apple in half, and remained silent longer than usual. He turned the half under the light, studied the flesh, and gently shook his head. "I don't recognize this one." He moved to the next tree and repeated the action. Again, he could not name it. Samuel smiled, but it was the smile of a man realizing he still had more to learn. Either these are extremely rare, or nobody has documented them. Margaret looked across the orchard. She no longer saw herself standing in an old apple grove. Before her was a living archive of history, where each row of trees might hold a piece of memory that many generations had lost. Samuel closed his notebook and said, "What you found isn't just farmland, it's a living archive." Margaret understood that the greatest reward was not the value of the land or the first apples. The most precious thing was the chance to preserve a living heritage. But she also understood something else. Finding it did not mean she had saved it. To save this orchard, she had to learn to understand the entire ecosystem that had quietly protected it for decades. That afternoon, as the two of them prepared to leave the central area, Samuel suddenly stopped and looked toward the hillside, still covered in kudzu. That was the section Margaret had not touched since the day the goats refused to enter. He stood still for a few seconds, and then said quietly, "We're not finished." Margaret no longer looked at the orchard through the eyes of someone who had just found a treasure. After the conversation with Samuel Pierce, she began to see it as an aging body just waking after decades of sleep. A body like that could not be forced to change in only a few weeks. The very next morning, Margaret discarded the plan to clear all the kudzu that she had written in her notebook. Instead, she divided the orchard into the small sections, exactly as Samuel had instructed. Each year, only one more area would be opened. Each season, the light would advance only a little farther. The remaining parts would stay as they were to protect the moisture and temperature around roots that had grown accustomed to the old environment for generations. The work became much slower. Some days, Margaret cleared only a few yards of vines and then stopped. At first, that made her feel as if she were moving backward, but after only a few weeks, the trees that had been wilting began to put out new shoots. The young branches no longer withered under the sun. The soil under the canopies held moisture longer. By the end of summer, the remaining apples ripened slowly, but with deeper flavour than before. The orchard did not revive because it was freed quickly. It revived because at last it was restored according to the exact rhythm its nature required. News of the orchard gradually spread through Unicoi County. This time, people no longer came to laugh. They came to see with their own eyes the rows of trees that had slept for decades. One early autumn morning, Margaret was resetting a section of fence when she heard a vehicle stop behind her. She turned and saw Luke Dawson step down with a roll of steel wire on his shoulder. He stood awkwardly for a few seconds before speaking. "Thought you might need another pair of hands." Margaret looked at him, then at the roll of wire. Luke did not repeat the mocking remark from the auction. He also did not apologize. He simply worked quietly beside her, setting new fence posts around the recently restored area. Sometimes the greatest change in a person is not in words, but in what they choose to do after realizing they were wrong. That afternoon, Margaret sat on the hillside watching the 12 goats graze leisurely on the lower ground. She remembered the first morning they had all stopped together in front of the kudzu wall. For weeks, she had thought they had found the orchard, but now she understood that had never been true. The goats did not know that behind the vines lay an ancient apple orchard. They also did not know the historical value of the varieties sleeping in the shade. They only did what instinct told them. They knew where not to step. It was Margaret who learned the meaning of that silence. If that day she had dragged them forward with ropes, the orchard might have remained buried for many more years. What changed the entire story was not the strength of the goats. It was that she had been patient enough to stop and ask herself why they refused to go farther. Through each season, the orchard continued to be restored in small sections. The rows of trees grew stronger. The heritage apple varieties were marked, recorded, and carefully tended. A few rare ones were propagated for preservation, while many other areas remained under kudzu waiting their turn. Margaret no longer tried to conquer the land. She became its companion. The greatest reward she received was not the value of the 50 acres, but the chance to preserve a living piece of history. Looking at the rows of trees swaying gently in the evening breeze, Margaret remembered Samuel's final words. "The land remembers its value long after people forget it." Those who learn to listen before they change the land often become the ones trusted to protect its history. She understood that the land always holds memory longer than people do. Some values do not disappear with time. They only wait for someone patient enough to listen. If one day you stand before a piece of land the whole county calls worthless, will you see only weeds? Or will you be patient enough to ask a question no one has ever wanted to answer? And if you love stories of rural American history, survival skills, and wisdom preserved through generations, subscribe to the channel so we can explore together the things time seemed to have forgotten.